Welcome, everyone. I am Sarah Jane Demy, the founder and CEO of Demy-Colton, and we'd like to welcome you to the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series. Demy-Colton's mission is all about convening industry leaders to catalyze change. Innovation exists when individuals are united by a cause and shared passion. And in our industry, that cause and passion is bringing cures and therapeutics to people in need. So despite these challenging times, we want to continue our mission of bringing thought leaders together, hence the birth of the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series. Today, we are excited to feature our first virtual salon, a fireside chat. Jeremy Abbott will lead this discussion about the future of healthcare, innovation, change and urgency with Dr. Ralph Snyderman. Jeremy and Ralph will also be speaking at our BioFuture conference in New York, which has been postponed until next year due to COVID. Due to the overwhelming interest we generated in the content of BioFuture, we decided to present some of the discussions that will take place there and will continue to do so until our in-person conference. Now it is my pleasure to introduce these two eminent thought leaders to you. Leading the discussion is Jeremy Abbott. Sorry, I said it the Italian way. Jeremy is Vice President and Publisher of Scientific American and its related titles. He is responsible for developing and executing new media programs, brand extensions, and collaborative ventures, serving the international opinion leadership that turns to Scientific American for the best views of the future. Jeremy is highly sought after as both a facilitator and panelist, and we are very pleased that Scientific American is also a founding sponsor of BioFuture. With that said, let me turn the discussion over to Jeremy. Jeremy?
Thank you, Sarah, and wonderful to be here, helping to foster a discussion around the future of healthcare, innovation, change, and urgency. And I am delighted to have with me to discuss this an amazing visionary in this field. Dr. Ralph Snyderman is Chancellor Emeritus and James B. Duke Professor of Medicine at Duke University. He has played a leading role in the conception and development of personalized healthcare. The Association of American Medical Colleges has referred to Dr. Snyderman as the father of personalized medicine. He is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I'm thrilled to welcome you, Dr. Snyderman, to this discussion. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jeremy. It is wonderful to be with you, and I'll feel even better when we're together next year in New York, hopefully with a lot of COVID-19 behind us.
That would be an amazing sight to imagine. And with that, let's dive into, I think, one of the key words in the title of this discussion, innovation, change, and urgency. You know, in any other year, this would be an incredibly important topic. But now we are looking at a global pandemic. We are looking at healthcare in a way that I don't think we've looked at in a number of years. We've seen the pain points in our system. We've seen inequities in our system. We've also seen unfettered acts of heroism on the part of healthcare providers. I'd like to begin by having you maybe sketch out, what do you see as some of the key lessons we have learned from this event, from this unprecedented event, and what can the global healthcare community take as lessons from this urgent situation?
Well, as you said, this is a very urgent situation, and it is a situation unlike what the world has ever seen before. So this is totally new, and the ending is still unknown as we talk. But I think there are a number of very important lessons, and if one has any view of optimism, we could think of, hopefully, this was really kind of a wake-up call to humanity to understand the perils of not appreciating the importance of health and healthcare. Fundamentally, that is one of the greatest resources and values that any individual can have. And facing the possibility of losing this, which is what the world has seen, we have stopped almost dead in our tracks. So one big lesson is, let's take health and healthcare more seriously. We've kind of known that all along intuitively, but it has not been front of mind. It is now front of mind. The other learnings are that, similar to what we've really understood about healthcare as well before, but didn't pay enough attention to it, is that in thinking about healthcare, or in many, many things, we should be proactive, we should be preventative, we should have a plan, and we need to be coordinated. The pandemic that we're suffering through now, it may have been inevitable that there would be a jumping of a virus to humans and there would be susceptibility, but I think everybody would agree that there has not been sufficient anticipation, planning, and coordination. Now, we knew better. Tony Fauci and I actually grew up a few blocks away from each other in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. He came down to Duke in 2004 to give a lecture on the danger of pandemics, and pretty much said, this is going to happen in one way or another. So I think, Jeremy, what we have really learned, again, the importance of health, planning for health, healthcare should not be taken for granted. Look what it has cost us for failing to do so. And there are much better ways of doing it if we are proactive, preventative, coordinated, and have a plan.
I'm going to pick up on the preventative part, and I'm going to also pick up on some of the other P's you talked about, planning, precision. Before I do, I just want to remind the viewing audience that during this talk, if you've got questions, if you want to hear something that you're not hearing, please write it into your Q&A box, and we're going to have some time for Q&A after our chat. But I would want to just pick up one of those themes that you talked about, planning, preventative. You've been a champion of precision medicine. You've been, again, called the father of precision medicine. You've been a kind of a futurist around what healthcare could look like if we are more predictive. Getting back to, again, this pandemic and COVID-19, specifically around that model, what can we learn about preventive medicine and precision medicine, in light of what you just spoke about, our lessons of COVID-19?
Okay, I think that's a very important question. And let me just go back a little bit and put this in context. The introduction of science into the practice of medicine is a relatively new thing. Until a little bit over 100 years ago, the concepts of health and disease were thought to be due to the balance of four humors in the body that circulated together, golden bile, black bile, phlegm, blood, and that if these were in balance, the person was healthy, and if they weren't, the person was unhealthy. And then lo and behold, through discoveries of Pasteur and Koch at the end of the 19th century, they found that disease could be caused by microorganisms that could not be seen without a microscope, that could be responsible for a disease as complex as tuberculosis. This created almost an epiphany that, my golly, disease actually has a cause, and it could be something particulate. From this grew, I would say, the first transformation of healthcare into what is still the current era, a concept that for any disease, there is a specific cause, and the role of the physician in healthcare is to find it and fix it. This got us tremendous progress from the early 1900s until almost now, when we realize that complex diseases, important complex diseases, are not due necessarily to a single initiating factor. They have multiple causes. And that the other thing that is even more important is that the development of disease or improvement of health is a continuum. It is not an endpoint, but it is a continuum. And it is determined by one's genetic background as well as what one is exposed to over time. So with this understanding in mind, that disease, that if we think about health, we need to go beyond disease, find it and fix it, to understand that since this is dynamic, we may be able to predict it, prevent it, and personalize it. And this gave rise to the concept of personalized and now precision medicine. The thing that is very exciting about this is that it now becomes possible due to technology and know-how. Well, what does this have to do with COVID? To me, the example is strikingly relevant in that the way we have dealt with COVID-19 is the way we deal with disease still today, predominantly. You wait till it happens, and then you try to fix it. And look what happened. It got out of hand, it grew, and fixing it has not yet been easy. But if you think about this model of preventative, predictive, proactive, personalized, planned medicine, you would say what we should have been doing, similar to what we do for tsunamis that occur in the ocean, you have all kinds of warning signs in different places to see if currents are developing. And if you do, you could set warnings for specific areas. So even if we could not have prevented the initial transmission of COVID-19 to a human, we could have been much more alert in detecting it and then having a plan. When this happens, this is what we do next. So I think, Jeremy, this is one of the biggest lessons in saying this is directly applicable to healthcare. Our current healthcare system resembles more of how we dealt with COVID-19, with its strengths and weaknesses, but we could do better.
Okay, so let me take that a step further. Obviously, it's a hard lesson to learn, but this is this tests the model in a way that is writ large. I think you've distilled very eloquently how if we had used this model, we would be in a better situation right now. But we are still talking about an RNA-based pathogen. What if we talk about a multifactorial disease state, such as neurodegenerative disease, Alzheimer's, ALS? How close is your model for disease states such as those? And I want to just briefly, mention, you make a great point about the historical examples. The last 100 years has seen science transform medicine. I would even argue in some cases we are a victim of our own success because there is this expectation that every disease is going to have some point very soon a cure. But how does your model apply to these multifactorial disease states such as Alzheimer's that have perplexed scientists for a century?
Well, I would say that if we think about the here and now, things that we understand, and we understand the mechanism and evolution and other things that we don't yet understand. So let me take, before we get to Alzheimer's disease or neurodegenerative disease, let's talk about type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, many of the causes of pulmonary fibrosis, smoking or pollution. These are complex diseases, but we have a good understanding of what some of the initiating factors are and how they might be prevented. So let's say with cardiovascular disease, we know that there's a strong genetic background for it, even though we haven't identified the genes. And one could identify early on, based on family history and other parameters that we could measure, lipid levels, if somebody is susceptible, and even over time, if they're increasing susceptibility. There are drugs that we could use, statins, there are tests that we could use, but inevitably, and very, very importantly, for many of these complex preventable diseases, it's the individual's behavior that is one of the most important things. So if we characterize some of the biggest drivers of healthcare expenditures and disability today in the United States, there are much better ways of dealing with them. Take now Alzheimer's disease, neurodegenerative diseases, many forms of cancer. They are inevitably going to occur. I tend to be more optimistic than pessimistic, but I don't believe that we're going to be able to prevent and cure all diseases, and I don't believe we'll be able to extend healthy life beyond, let's say, the biblical 125 years, which would be very nice. I would take that today. But we will be able to more and more and more, once we understand Alzheimer's disease. There may be certain characteristics. We know that Alzheimer's disease is going to be multifactorial. There are going to be a number of different pathways to get there, likely. Some of them we may be able to block, others not. There are genetic forms of Alzheimer's where susceptibility is increased tremendously. It's unlikely we're going to be able to prevent them now. Ultimately, we may develop a cure. But I think the good news is that here and now, we could be doing so much better than we are currently doing.
So, we've been hearing about this model for a while. Certainly, in America, we like to hype innovation to the point where the word is almost meaningless.
Right.
What would you say to those that say, well, this is an overhyped model? What kind of real examples could you give to show that it's, not that far away? You've given a few, and for those that would say, I think this is, still just an overhyped concept. How would you answer to those constituents?
Well, let me just say a word or two more about the concept. And the concept is based on what we believe to be the truth, and that is an individual's health or lack of health is a consequence of their genetic inheritance, plus everything that they do and whatever they're exposed to over time. And this is a dynamic event over one's lifetime. So that if you think that disease evolves over time, most of the time, an individual who's going to get a disease does not yet have the disease. But the disease may be progressing without them or their clinician knowing about it. Once it does become manifest, there are times and ways to minimize the damage that's done. So so we need to think about personalized precision medicine as a continuum, enhancing health and well-being, preventing disease, minimizing it or mitigating when it occurs, and at times treating it with precision. So I think the biggest advances in this field have been in the latter part, in which an individual develops a disease, and rather than treating one size fits all, we specifically identify as much as we can the mechanism of that person's disease and intervene specifically to them. So the biggest advances thus far, which I think is a proof of concept, at least a part of this, is what's happened to cancer therapy. Cancer therapy, probably the most dread disease in Western civilization today. Now, when an individual develops cancer, if they have the appropriate care, not only will one have the usual way of defining the cancer with histopathology, but there'll be a genetic analysis to see if there are specific driver mutations that are responsible for that cancer. So the cancer is characterized based on what is driving it. And then depending on that, you try to find a driver mutation or a driver pathway and specifically target therapy to that. That has revolutionized the treatment of cancer. It's still a small percentage, but it's revolutionized the treatment. If you go to the other end of the spectrum, enhancing health and well-being, here, unfortunately, in some ways, it's only been for those people who could afford it. You know, what we call concierge medicine, in which they pay substantially extra to a physician who helps them develop their own health plan and has many, many different tests that determine susceptibility. And there, in much, much smaller numbers, it proves to be successful. We have this big middle ground that we need to break through. And I think that, to me, being optimistic, with all the horrible aspects of COVID-19, I think it will stimulate moving in this direction.
Well, I'm going to pick up the access question and equitability question in a second, because we have some viewer questions coming in related to that. But before I do, if you can talk tech for a couple of minutes and maybe just talk about some of the innovations, whether it's data analytics, mobile health, personal genomics, you know, from your perspective, what do you see as some of the more transformational platforms that will help drive this new model of which you have been embracing for a while now?
Okay, this is what I find most exciting, and anticipating, hopefully seeing things really changing within the next decade. And that is the ability to predict, to really, in a very fine way, predict an individual's susceptibility to disease, and then even beyond predicting, determining what are those factors that enhance the development of disease or diminish it, and then to be able to track it over time. So you could kind of see how you're doing. You don't need to do this every day necessarily, but you could track over time. This is where I am in this time of my life. These are my susceptibilities. These are my strengths. These are the things that I ought to avoid. These are the things I ought to do more of. Now, the ability to predict and track in a very meaningful way is entering a whole new era in which I will call the second major transformation of medicine. The first one, as I said, was germ theory and the scientific basis of disease. Now we're understanding the basis of health and the dynamics of disease. There's a whole different ballpark. One of the things that is going to be driving this, Jeremy, and you mentioned technology, is whole genome sequencing. You know, we indicated that what makes you what you are now and me what I am now have been up until now our genetics that have been interacting with the environment, all the things that we have been exposed to and that we have done. So understanding the meaning of one's genome sequence in great detail is now being made possible by the fact that whole genome sequencing can probably be done in the range of $100 to $200 and still continues to fall. That is unbelievable. The additional thing that is becoming empowered by technology, and a lot of it is information technology, is the ability to aggregate and accumulate massive amounts of data. So envision this. You have you or you have me and millions of people like us throughout the world have their genes sequenced, and then they're given, as I'm wearing, a smartwatch and various other things that could measure things real time, and things that could measure sleep, and things that could measure your electrolytes and various other things. And you track all of those people, and you see if they do get ill, what illness they get, if they are getting even more robust, and you aggregate all that data. And with machine learning and artificial intelligence, start teasing apart what are those factors that are driving this ultimate effect or that ultimate effect. Mm-hmm. So what we are thinking about more and more, the ability to predict an individual's health pathway is becoming more and more vivid, and it will be much more vivid 5-10 years down the road when worldwide multiple millions of people, studies of the kind that I'm talking about, will have their effect. So at that time, what I would envision, you called me a futurist. I love that word. I don't know if anybody's called me that before. I'm not sure exactly what it is. But one of the things that I envision, and this may sound totally crazy to you, if we ever get back in our cars again, and I'm hoping it occurs before this annual meeting next year or when it's going to be, when you get in your car, very often you start with where you are and you're going somewhere else 200 miles away. You punch it in to your computer. GPS gives you a little pathway, tells you how to go. This is the favorite way to go. This is another way to go. This is where the traffic cops are. This is where various other things are. And you get in your car and you find the best pathway. Believe it or not, we are moving towards, for individuals to develop a GPS for their own health. That, we're far from it right now, but if you were to put me on the futurist line and say, what would I expect to be seeing 10 years from now, is that more and more we will be developing meaningful tools for an individual to be able to have a way of navigating their optimal health.
Wow. I think that's a future we can all embrace and we look forward to. And amazing discussion, really provocative discussion. I'm gonna draw upon some of the questions that have come in for you, Ralph. And one of them is something that I think is quite provocative. Years ago, of course, when a woman thought she may be pregnant, she had to go to, her doctor. A test had to be done. It had to be sent out to a lab. And of course, not too long after, it was a completely different experience. You could go to a drugstore, get a home pregnancy test, and really take out, leapfrog that health infrastructure. So question coming in here, there are players like CVS, Walmart, Google, Apple, getting into the health disruption scene. How do you see these players affecting the experience an everyday individual has when it comes to their healthcare?
Well, I think you really nailed it. I think that if we look at how healthcare has been delivered up until now or recently, it has been that either there has been a physician and then larger groups of physicians and larger provider organizations that had a specific location, and one went there to get their health care. And they were the font of wisdom in all potential applications to modifying health. Now we have disruptors. I would call them disruptors, and I think you named many of them: Apple and Google, and Dr. Google. Google Alphabet is investing billions of dollars into wanting to be every person's physician to a large degree through primarily information that could be attained at the point of wherever that individual is. Apple has already shown, and Fitbit and Garmin and many others have shown that they could develop smart instruments that allow individuals to measure an awful lot of relevant health determining and measuring data at the point of the individual. So healthcare is being disrupted. Healthcare is going to be moving from a central location, maybe distributed out, to the individual having their own capability to be able to reach to the resources that are most relevant to them. There's going to be a major transfer of power from the central provider to the point of the individual. and that is disrupting. And it's certainly been sensed by Apple and Google. And you mentioned Walmart, and you mentioned CVS and Walgreens. They are disrupting care by saying, moving towards, we could do primary care away from a big medical center or a big doctor's office. You could go to Walmart, and while you're waiting for this or that, or you could go see a primary care doctor there, and
Yep.
you see where it's going. So I think the disruption is the movement from a central area of you got to come to see me here to putting the patient with particularly if you have the patient with their personal health plan, think of the power that they have in navigating their own health.
Yeah, let's talk about the changing structure. You mentioned the old model was the doctor, and that healthcare structure was kind of where people went for every healthcare need. It was much like in the Middle Ages, you went to the church for just about everything, and now that's changing. Okay, so in a perfect world, you'd have this decentralized set of structures where the patient was ultimately the one in power. Now, another question has come in, which is very much along the lines where I think I wanted to go. What are the privacy concerns when, your health records are part of a larger ecosystem where, yes, you may be empowered to go to different places, but, how does that affect the ethics of who owns these records? Presumably the patient would. But when a bunch of commercial players are now entering the scene, how do we make sure we don't just redo that monolithic structure and have some other structure come in its place?
Well, that is a very critical question, a very important issue, and I wish I had a clear-cut answer for you other than saying that you are absolutely right, that we need to identify this as issues that we need to deal with. Otherwise, they will create tremendous inequities or block progress that otherwise could be very beneficial. So let me just first say a word or two about privacy. There are a series of laws, generally called HIPAA laws, which is federal regulation to protect patient privacy. They are very clear-cut and very restrictive of sharing patient-identified information by anyone other than the patient and their specific caring physicians. And the penalties for abrogating this are very, very severe. So and this is all rapidly evolving, or will be rapidly evolving. Having the appropriate protections of patient privacy is absolutely essential. Many, many companies have established themselves in developing communications between patient and physician, and what they bring to the table is the guarantee of absolute ironclad privacy. So that needs to be part and parcel. The last thing in the world that you would ever want is to have a patient's genetic information to be shared with an employer or an insurer in ways that would be unfair for the individual. And I think the ethics of this also need an awful lot of scrutiny. And I think the issue of privacy and ethics go hand in hand, and it's a job yet to be fully done, but very important to identify.
Getting back to the issue at hand, the pandemic, there's so many ethical issues, some of which you just spoke about, but choices that have to be made by healthcare professionals during a crisis. I think one thing that this pandemic, this unprecedented event has shined a light on is the limitations of our current infrastructure, particularly with hospitals overflowing, not enough beds. What do you imagine the hospital system looking like in the future? And also, what would a typical, as a follow-up on that, what would a typical annual checkup look like in the future? And what does our larger hospital system look like in the future in kind of this new model of health that you're envisioning?
Well, what has become tremendously clear through COVID-19 is that the hospital and the hospital network is not sustainable in the future. It certainly didn't work at COVID-19 because you have these large provider structures with many, many beds and patients coming in with various diseases. And lo and behold, you have COVID-19 and you have to shut everything else down and focus with COVID-19. And with COVID-19, there weren't enough, there was a lot of concern, not enough high-intensity beds and ventilators and trained people, et cetera, et cetera. So what has become understandable real time, and obviously I have the most knowledge of what is going on at Duke, is that we need to rapidly gear up with our intensive care for COVID-19. And in spades, this has occurred in New York. I mean, what happened there was unbelievable and amazingly heroic. The rapidity of scaling up to deal with thousands and thousands of people with a particular need. But what has become obvious as we look to things other than COVID-19 is that why in the world would we bring a patient into an area in which they may have vulnerability or susceptibility and also a concern and a fear? We need to start thinking about distributing our care where we start delivering care in a way similar to this this salon that we're having now. We're doing it by televideo. And so we are now understanding that at the central hub of the hospital, we need to envision it in the future. There will always be, unfortunately, instances of severe illness that require a lot of intervention, sophisticated, high-tech intervention. They are done best in this hospital, this big central hospital. So we're moving more and more towards high intervention, surgery, things that cannot be done elsewhere, intensive care units, et cetera, and we're moving everything else further out into community settings, into community hospitals. But now we're going even beyond that. We're saying, why don't we do it right at the individual's home? Let them pick up their smartphone, and we could do it that way. So from the center of healthcare delivery, there is a diffusion out, and that starting to occur. It's going to be much, much greater. A diffusion out. How far can you take it? It is much more cost effective. All kinds of good things with it. Then there's going to be, as you talked about before, the disruptors, who are causing a change from the outside in. Hey, wait a second, I have this information with me right here. I could do it, right here. So hopefully those two will meet and give us a much more broadly rational, distributed healthcare delivery system.
And for a more mundane example, the typical annual visit to the doctor. Yes. Will that be more and more a virtual experience? Will it be an integrated experience? How would that play out?
Well, that's a very good question. Let me start with what I would love to see the physical be as opposed to what it has been and still is. There is an annual physical that is paid for by Medicare. The reason for that, quite frankly, having been involved, at least behind the scenes, with that legislation, that there ought to be an opportunity for an annual primary care visit, is the anticipation that during that visit, the physician or the caregiver ought to specifically interact with you to say, Jeremy, you today, this is the status of your health, as best as we could do it with a lot of tools. And even more importantly, these are your proximate risks. Over the next 3 months, this next year, these are your risks and your ways you could mitigate them. And oh, by the way, over 10, 15, 20 years, you ought to start thinking about that. So what I am anticipating is that this personal visit to the physician, primary care physician, will be an annual let's say re-upping of your personal health plan. Let's bring it to immediacy to define your risks and your best pathway to health. So I think the visit will be much more along the lines of what we talked about: personalized, predictive, preventative, and planned, and then also encouraging you to engage in your care, because ultimately you're the most important navigator of it. Now, whether we could move that to a virtual visit, I think it is possible. What I also believe is that human interaction between the individual and a caregiver, a physician who truly knows them and cares for them, and developing that trusting relationship, that may still benefit people seeing each other. I mean, once we get out of this, you're alone in a room, I'm alone in a room, Sarah's alone in a room. Hopefully, we're going to start seeing other human beings again. And there is tremendous value in this interaction with others. So I think it's going to be like an equilibrium reaction. It'll go back and forth and then ultimately set in something that makes the most sense. And it may very well be that it's a virtual visit, but it may actually be better if two people come face to face.
Yeah. Sounds like there is kind of a hybrid future that awaits us.
Yes.
And,
yes.
to take an analogy from my industry, publishing, when we all saw the digital age, truly disrupt what was happening in the world of print, we found there was this equilibrium that is reached, that you consume information in different formats. And sometimes you love the intimacy of print, and you also maybe love the immediacy of the digital world. So it sounds like, in your view, we will find, hopefully, what technology can give us, and we'll take from the good. And like all technology, which can be sometimes a Faustian bargain, we can try and minimize what is not so great about those changes.
I couldn't agree with you more. First of all, keep on printing some things for people like me, because I love holding in my hand and actually reading it, in addition to the digital. But the other point that you made, and I really want to emphasize this to the entire group, regardless of what we could do with digital support and technologies and interventions, the most important individual in one's health is themselves. That may sound like motherhood and apple pie, but believe me, I've been in this field for a while now. Ultimately, it's what the individual does, and also their mindset, their beliefs, that is the biggest driver. We could support this with our technologies and know-how, but ultimately, I am hoping that COVID-19 enhances the awareness of individuals of how important their health is as their own resource.
Yeah. Well, it's a great point to underscore the individual is at the center of this, not anyone else. We are unfortunately out of time, but I just want to thank you, Ralph, for an informative, entertaining, and of course, enlightening chat. So wonderful to hear from you. We will be following the story of health's future, the innovation, the urgency, and I want to thank you for sharing your insights with the audience.
Jeremy, thank you so much. I enjoyed it greatly. And Sarah, thank you for inviting both of us.
Oh, you've both been great. You've both been great. In fact, I think this is only the tip of the iceberg of a discussion that could go on much longer. And I'm sure both of you realize that. So we'll continue it until we do BioFuture in April next year. So thank you both for a really thoughtful discussion. We're grateful for your time and your insights today. And we want to thank all of our BioFuture sponsors for their unwavering and continuing support. And that includes you, of course, Jeremy. And finally, we would like to thank our audience for joining us today and to ask that you please participate in the brief survey that will launch momentarily. We hope all of you will join us for our next Demy-Colton virtual salon, which is coming soon. Until then, stay safe, everyone.